Imagine if Amazon's stock price jumped 900% in 6 months. Now imagine if that happened because Amazon claimed they'd discovered a way to mine gold from seawater. Finally, imagine if the British government bet their entire national debt on this impossible scheme. That's exactly what happened in 1720, when the South Sea Company's stock soared from 128 US to $1,050 per share in less than 8 months. At its peak, this single company was valued at more than the entire British economy, roughly $4 trillion in today's money. The South Sea Company promised to eliminate Britain's crushing war debt through trade profits from South America. They claimed exclusive access to Spanish colonial markets worth billions. They guaranteed returns that would make every investor wealthy beyond imagination. There was just one problem. It was all a lie. The South Sea Company had no significant trade operations, no access to Spanish markets, no realistic plan for generating the profits they promised. What they had was the greatest stock manipulation scheme in history, backed by the highest levels of British government. When reality finally hit, the crash was apocalyptic. Fortunes that had taken generations to build vanished overnight. Noble families lost ancestral estates. Middle-class investors faced bankruptcy. Working people who'd mortgaged their homes to buy shares found themselves homeless. But the human cost was just the beginning. The South Sea bubble's collapse triggered Europe's first modern financial crisis. Banks failed across the continent. International trade collapsed. Governments that had bet their treasuries on South Sea stock faced insolvency. The crisis destroyed public trust in financial institutions for generations. It sparked political revolution that toppled the British government. It created economic instability that influenced European politics for decades. Yet the masterminds behind the scheme made fortunes, while ordinary investors lost everything. Government officials who enabled the fraud escaped punishment while victims faced ruin. The powerful protected themselves while the powerless paid the price. This wasn't just a stock market crash. It was a systematic betrayal of public trust by the most powerful institutions in British society. It was proof that financial markets could be manipulated by insiders who understood the game better than the people they were robbing. The South Sea bubble revealed something terrifying about human nature. When greed and fear combine with mass psychology, entire societies can lose their ability to distinguish between reality and fantasy. This is the story of how one impossible promise destroyed an empire's economy and changed the course of European history forever. London in 1711 was a city suffocating under the weight of national debt. Britain had been fighting the War of Spanish Succession for 9 years, a global conflict that had drained the royal treasury and pushed government borrowing to unprecedented levels. The numbers were staggering. Britain's national debt had reached 9.4 million, equivalent to roughly 4 trillion in modern purchasing power. Interest payments alone consumed 40% of all government revenue. Traditional tax collection couldn't generate enough income to service existing debt, let alone finance continuing military operations. Worse, Britain's creditors were losing confidence in the government's ability to repay its obligations. Government bonds were trading at steep discounts. Foreign lenders were demanding higher interest rates. The Bank of England, founded just 17 years earlier, lacked the resources to provide sufficient credit for both government needs and commercial activity. Britain faced a choice: default on their debt and destroy their international credit rating, or find revolutionary new methods for financing government operations. Into this crisis stepped one of the most audacious schemes in financial history. The South Sea Company was founded in 1711 by Robert Harley, Chancellor of the Exchequer, and John Blunt, a mathematician turned financier who understood market psychology better than perhaps anyone alive. Their proposal was elegantly simple and completely unprecedented. The South Sea Company would assume responsibility for Britain's entire national debt. In exchange, they would receive exclusive trading rights to Spanish colonial territories in South America. Profits from this trade, estimated at millions of pounds annually, would easily cover debt service while generating enormous returns for company shareholders. The plan seemed to solve everyone's problems simultaneously. The government would eliminate its debt burden without raising taxes or cutting spending. Investors would gain access to the legendary wealth of South American gold and silver mines. The South Sea Company would control what many believed was the most lucrative trade monopoly in the world. But the plan rested on one crucial assumption: that Spain would allow British merchants to trade freely in their South American colonies. This assumption was not just optimistic, it was delusional. Spain had spent 2 centuries building a colonial empire specifically designed to exclude foreign merchants. Spanish law prohibited non-Spanish traders from conducting business in colonial territories. Spanish naval forces patrolled South American waters to prevent unauthorized commerce. Spanish colonial administrators faced execution for allowing foreign trade. The War of Spanish Succession was being fought partly because European powers wanted access to Spanish colonial trade. Spain was willing to fight a global war to prevent exactly the kind of commercial access the South Sea Company claimed they would receive. Yet somehow, the South Sea Company convinced Britain's financial and political elite that Spanish hostility to foreign trade would magically disappear once the war ended. How did intelligent, experienced leaders fall for such an obvious impossibility? The answer lies in the psychological dynamics that make financial bubbles possible. The South Sea Scheme succeeded not because it was plausible, but because it promised solutions to problems that seemed otherwise unsolvable. Britain's debt crisis was real and urgent. Traditional financing methods had been exhausted. Political leaders were desperate for alternatives that would avoid the social unrest that tax increases or spending cuts would provoke. In this context, the South Sea Company's promises seemed not just attractive but necessary. Government officials wanted to believe the scheme would work because they couldn't imagine realistic alternatives. They convinced themselves that Spanish colonial policy would change because they needed it to change. This phenomenon, believing in unrealistic solutions to real problems, would prove to be the psychological foundation of the entire bubble. But the South Sea Scheme's early success depended on more than wishful thinking. It required sophisticated understanding of how financial markets and government institutions actually operated. John Blunt was not a naive optimist. He was a brilliant manipulator who had studied every major financial operation in European history. He understood that the South Sea Company's success would depend not on actual trade profits, but on maintaining investor confidence long enough to extract maximum value from rising stock prices. The real business model was never South American trade. It was stock manipulation on a scale never before attempted. Blunt had observed how the Bank of England and East India Company had used government connections and exclusive privileges to generate enormous wealth for their shareholders. He realized that controlling government debt gave financial institutions leverage over government policy that could be exploited for private benefit. The South Sea Company was designed to maximize this leverage while minimizing actual business risk. By assuming responsibility for government debt, the company would become essential to Britain's financial stability. Government officials would have powerful incentives to support company operations and protect company interests. The company's exclusive trading rights would create artificial scarcity that inflated stock values regardless of actual business performance. Most importantly, the company's complex financial structure would make it nearly impossible for outsiders to evaluate whether the company's promises were realistic. The South Sea Company's original charter ran to over 200 pages of dense legal language that few people fully understood. The trading privileges were described in terms so vague that almost any commercial activity could be justified as falling within company authority. The debt conversion mechanisms were so complex that even experienced financiers struggled to calculate actual risks and potential returns. This complexity was deliberate. It created an information advantage that company insiders could exploit while preventing external oversight that might have revealed the scheme's fundamental flaws. By 1712, the South Sea Company had successfully launched their operations. They'd convinced Parliament to grant their charter. They'd negotiated favorable terms for debt conversion. They'd attracted initial investors who provided the capital needed to begin operations. But they still hadn't addressed the fundamental problem. They had no realistic method for generating the profits they'd promised. The solution they developed would create the largest financial bubble in history and established techniques for market manipulation that continue to influence financial crimes today. But first, they had to survive the challenges of actually operating a business while maintaining the illusion that their impossible promises were achievable. Chapter 1. War Debt. The letter that would change British financial history arrived at Queen Anne's private chambers on November 15, 1711, sealed with the Chancellor's official wax. Robert Harley, Earl of Oxford and Britain's chief financial minister, requested an urgent audience to discuss what he called a solution to our most pressing difficulties. Those difficulties were crushing the British Empire. 9 years of war against France and Spain had devastated government finances. Every major battle required thousands of pounds for weapons, supplies, and soldiers' wages. Naval operations consumed enormous sums, maintaining fleets across 3 oceans. Colonial defense costs had multiplied as fighting spread from Europe to America to the Caribbean. The arithmetic was terrifying. Britain's annual government revenue totaled approximately $6.3 million, but servicing existing debt required $3.2 million annually, over half of all income. Military expenses demanded another $4.8 million. The government was spending $8 million annually, while collecting only $6.3 million. This $1.7 million annual deficit had been financed through increasingly desperate borrowing. Government bonds carried interest rates of 6% to 8% because investors doubted Britain's ability to repay. Short-term loans commanded even higher rates. Some emergency financing had been arranged at usurious rates exceeding 12%. Worse, Britain's borrowing capacity was approaching its limits. Domestic lenders had already committed most available capital to government debt. Foreign creditors were demanding security guarantees that Britain couldn't provide. The Bank of England, struggling with its own capital constraints, couldn't expand government lending without risking institutional collapse. Queen Anne understood the crisis better than most monarchs grasped financial details. She'd personally witnessed how debt service consumed resources needed for essential government functions. Court expenses had been reduced repeatedly, infrastructure projects had been cancelled, even royal household staff had accepted reduced wages to preserve government liquidity. But the human cost of the debt crisis extended far beyond royal inconvenience. Tax collection had become increasingly aggressive as government desperately sought additional revenue. The excise tax on everyday goods like soap, leather, and candles had been raised multiple times. Land taxes fell most heavily on small farmers who could least afford increased burdens. Salt taxes affected every family in Britain, making essential food preservation more expensive. These tax increases generated popular resentment that threatened domestic political stability. Riots had erupted in several cities when new tax collectors arrived. Rural communities were organizing resistance to land tax assessments. Even traditionally loyal merchants were complaining that excessive taxation was destroying their international competitiveness. Most dangerously, the debt crisis was undermining Britain's war effort at the moment when military pressure might force favorable peace negotiations. The Duke of Marlborough's victories at Blenheim and Ramillies had demonstrated British military superiority when properly financed and equipped. But maintaining this advantage required sustained military spending that Britain's finances couldn't support. French intelligence had identified British financial weakness as their enemy's most vulnerable point. French negotiators were demanding territorial concessions that they might have abandoned if Britain could finance continued military pressure. Spanish resistance was stiffening because they calculated that British financial exhaustion would force eventual withdrawal from contested territories. The war that Britain was winning militarily might be lost financially unless revolutionary solutions could be found. Into this crisis stepped Robert Harley with a proposal that seemed almost too good to be true. Harley had been studying financial innovations throughout Europe, searching for models that might address Britain's unprecedented debt burden. He'd examined Dutch banking practices that had financed their war of independence. He'd analyzed Venetian trading companies that generated enormous profits from exclusive commercial privileges. He'd investigated French experiments with paper money that had temporarily solved their own debt problems. But Harley's breakthrough came from studying how the Bank of England had transformed government lending from individual transactions into institutional relationships. The Bank of England, chartered in 1694, had revolutionized government finance by creating permanent institutional commitment to debt service. Instead of borrowing from individual lenders who might withdraw their support, the government borrowed from an institution that had incentives to maintain long-term relationships. This institutional lending had several advantages. It reduced interest rates because institutional lenders could diversify their risks across multiple borrowers. It provided predictable financing because institutions planned for long-term operations rather than short-term profits. Most importantly, it gave government borrowers leverage over institutional lenders because institutions needed reliable borrowers to maintain their own profitability. Harley realized that these same principles could be applied on a much larger scale through a trading company that would assume responsibility for government debt in exchange for exclusive commercial privileges. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. A chartered company would convert existing government debt into company shares. Debt holders would exchange government bonds for company stock. The government would eliminate debt service obligations. The company would cover debt service through profits from their trading operations. Everyone would benefit. Government debt would disappear without new taxation or reduced spending. Creditors would receive potentially more valuable company shares instead of government bonds paying fixed interest. The company would control lucrative trading privileges that could generate profits exceeding debt service requirements. But the plan's success depended on identifying trading opportunities valuable enough to support such enormous financial obligations. Harley's research had convinced him that South American trade represented the greatest untapped commercial opportunity in the world. Spanish colonies in South America contained vast deposits of gold and silver that had financed Spanish power for over 2 centuries. But Spanish colonial policy restricted this trade to Spanish merchants operating through Spanish ports under Spanish supervision. This restriction created artificial scarcity that inflated prices throughout Europe. Goods that could be purchased cheaply in South America commanded premium prices in European markets because limited Spanish trade couldn't satisfy European demand. If British merchants could gain access to South American markets, they could purchase colonial goods at production costs and sell them at European premium prices. The profit margins would be enormous, easily sufficient to service Britain's entire national debt, while generating substantial returns for company investors. The challenge was convincing Spain to abandon colonial policies they'd maintained for 2 centuries. Harley believed this challenge was surmountable because the War of Spanish Succession was creating opportunities for negotiating new commercial arrangements. Spain was exhausted by 9 years of warfare. Their economy was suffering from military spending that exceeded their own financial capacity. Their colonial territories were experiencing disruptions that reduced the profitability of traditional Spanish trade. Most importantly, the war's eventual peace treaty would require territorial and commercial concessions from all participants. Britain could demand access to Spanish colonial trade as part of broader peace negotiations. Harley's proposal combined immediate financial relief with long-term commercial opportunity. The government would eliminate its debt crisis through the trading company's assumption of financial obligations. British merchants would gain access to colonial markets that promised unprecedented profits. British naval power would be enhanced by controlling trade routes that financed Spanish military capabilities. The proposal seemed to solve multiple problems simultaneously while creating new opportunities for British economic expansion. Queen Anne authorized Harley to develop detailed plans for implementing what would become the South Sea Company. But neither the Queen nor Harley fully understood the psychological and financial forces they were about to unleash. They were creating not just a trading company, but the institutional framework for the largest financial bubble in history. The South Sea Company would indeed eliminate Britain's debt crisis, but not through South American trade profits. They would do it through stock manipulation that transferred wealth from ordinary investors to government officials and company insiders. The war debt that seemed like an unsolvable crisis would become the foundation for the greatest financial fraud ever perpetrated by a government against its own people. Chapter 2. Brilliant Scheme. The man who would mastermind history's greatest financial fraud didn't look like a criminal. John Blunt appeared every inch the respectable gentleman as he entered the Royal Exchange Coffee House on December 3, 1711, carrying a leather portfolio that contained plans to revolutionize British finance. Blunt was 42 years old, impeccably dressed, and possessed of the kind of mathematical precision that made complicated financial concepts seem simple and inevitable. He'd spent 15 years studying every major commercial enterprise in Europe, identifying the psychological techniques that made certain ventures spectacularly profitable while others failed, despite superior business fundamentals. His conclusion was radical. Success in finance depended far more on managing investor psychology than on actual business performance. Blunt had observed how the East India Company maintained stock prices that far exceeded their actual trading profits by creating artificial scarcity and manipulating information flow to investors. He'd studied how Dutch banking houses used complex financial instruments to obscure risks while maximizing fees. He'd analyzed how government-chartered monopolies generated enormous wealth, not through operational efficiency, but through legal privileges that eliminated competition. These observations had convinced Blunt that the greatest fortunes came not from building better businesses, but from designing financial structures that transferred wealth from many investors to few insiders. The South Sea Company would be his masterpiece. Blunt's genius was recognizing that Britain's debt crisis created the perfect conditions for implementing his theories on an unprecedented scale. Traditional investment opportunities were limited by actual business constraints. A trading company could only generate profits proportional to the goods they successfully bought and sold. A manufacturing enterprise could only grow as fast as they could expand production capacity. A banking operation could only earn returns based on the spread between borrowing and lending rates. But a company that assumed responsibility for government debt operated according to different rules. Their obligations were fixed. They needed to service specific debt payments on predetermined schedules. But their potential revenues were unlimited because government support could create trading privileges and legal advantages that ordinary businesses couldn't access. Most importantly, the complexity of debt conversion would make it virtually impossible for outside investors to calculate whether the company's promises were realistic. Blunt had designed a financial structure so intricate that even experienced investors would struggle to understand how profits were supposed to be generated, how risks were distributed, or how actual performance could be measured against promised returns. The brilliance of this complexity was that it shifted the burden of proof from the company to skeptical investors. Instead of company officials needing to demonstrate that their plans were viable, doubters would need to prove that the plans were impossible. Given the complexity involved, such proof would require expertise that few investors possessed. Here's how Blunt's scheme worked. The South Sea Company would offer to exchange government debt for company shares at rates that appeared favorable to existing debt holders. Government bonds paying 6% annual interest would be converted to company shares that promised higher returns through trading profits. Debt holders would receive immediate benefits from this exchange. Company shares could be traded on secondary markets, providing liquidity that government bonds lacked. Share values could appreciate based on company performance, offering potential gains beyond fixed interest payments. Shareholders would participate in company profits that could exceed government bond returns, but the exchange terms contained hidden advantages for the company that ordinary investors couldn't recognize. Government bonds were traded at market prices that reflected investor skepticism about government repayment capacity. Many bonds traded at 20–30% below their face value because investors doubted whether the government could maintain debt service payments. The South Sea Company's exchange offer used face values rather than market prices for calculating conversion rates. This meant that debt holders would exchange bonds worth $70 in the market for company shares valued at $100 on paper, but the company would assume responsibility for only $70 in actual debt service. The $30 difference would become pure profit for company insiders without any corresponding business operations or genuine value creation. But this hidden profit was only the beginning of Blunt's manipulation strategy. The real genius was in how the company's trading privileges would be structured to maximize stock price appreciation regardless of actual business performance. Spain would eventually be forced to grant Britain some access to South American markets as part of peace treaty negotiations. The exact terms would be uncertain, but any access at all could be presented as validation of the company's business model. Even limited trading rights could be leveraged into stock price increases that far exceeded the actual commercial value of those rights. If the company gained permission to send one ship annually to Spanish colonial ports, this could be marketed as the beginning of unlimited commercial expansion. Blunt understood that stock prices were determined more by investor expectations than by current business reality. A company that controlled exclusive rights to potentially enormous markets would command high valuations, even if current profits were minimal. The key was managing information flow to ensure that positive developments received maximum publicity, while negative information was suppressed or reinterpreted as temporary setbacks. Blunt had developed sophisticated techniques for information management based on his study of successful market manipulations throughout European financial centers. Company announcements would be carefully timed to maximize psychological impact. Positive news would be released when market conditions were favorable for generating maximum price appreciation. Negative information would be buried in complex financial reports that few investors would understand. More importantly, the company would cultivate relationships with influential investors whose opinions shaped broader market sentiment. These opinion leaders would receive privileged access to company information and favorable terms for share purchases in exchange for public support of company prospects. The result would be artificially inflated demand for company shares that drove prices higher, regardless of actual business performance. But Blunt's most ingenious innovation was the subscription system that would make the South Sea Company accessible to ordinary investors while maximizing profits for insiders. Traditional investment required purchasing shares with immediate full payment. This limited investment opportunities to wealthy individuals who could afford substantial upfront costs. Blunt's subscription system allowed investors to purchase shares with minimal down payments, typically 10% of share price, while promising to pay the remainder in installments over several months. This system democratized investment by making expensive shares affordable to middle-class purchasers. A $100 share could be acquired for $10 down payment, with the balance due in future installments. But the subscription system also created psychological commitment that Blunt could exploit. Once investors made down payments, they had strong incentives to believe that share prices would appreciate enough to justify completing their purchases. Investors became emotionally invested in the company's success because they'd already committed money they couldn't afford to lose. More dangerously, the subscription system created artificial demand that inflated share prices beyond any realistic valuation. When thousands of investors made subscription commitments based on current share prices, they were essentially betting that prices would continue rising. This speculative demand drove prices higher, which attracted more speculative subscriptions, which drove prices even higher. The result was a self-reinforcing cycle where rising prices justified further price increases, completely independent of actual business fundamentals. Blunt had created what modern economists call a positive feedback loop, a system where initial success generates conditions that produce further success until external factors force a reversal. But Blunt had one more crucial insight that separated his scheme from ordinary financial speculation. Most market manipulations eventually collapsed when reality contradicted artificial valuations. Tulip mania ended when people realized that flower bulbs weren't actually worth more than houses. The Mississippi bubble burst when investors discovered that Louisiana swampland couldn't generate the profits they'd been promised. Blunt designed the South Sea scheme to survive these reality checks by ensuring that government officials had incentives to support the company even when business performance disappointed expectations. By assuming responsibility for government debt, the South Sea Company made themselves essential to British financial stability. Government officials couldn't allow the company to fail without risking national bankruptcy. This gave company leaders leverage to demand government support for their operations, even when those operations weren't generating promised profits. Government resources would be deployed to protect company interests because protecting the company meant protecting government finances. The South Sea Company wasn't just a business enterprise. It was a partnership between private greed and public power that would prove almost impossible to stop once it gained momentum. Blunt had created the perfect financial weapon, a scheme complex enough that few people could understand its flaws, profitable enough that powerful people would protect it, and essential enough that government authority would enforce its success regardless of its actual viability. All he needed now was political backing from officials desperate enough to embrace any solution to Britain's debt crisis. Chapter 3. Royal Backing. The royal audience that would launch the South Sea bubble took place in Queen Anne's private study at St. James's Palace on January 7, 1712. Present were the Queen herself, Chancellor Robert Harley, and John Blunt, who carried detailed plans for what he called the salvation of British credit. Queen Anne had spent the previous evening reviewing Harley's preliminary proposal with growing amazement. The South Sea Company would eliminate Britain's entire debt burden through profits from South American trade. Government borrowing would end. Tax increases would be unnecessary. Britain would emerge from their financial crisis stronger and wealthier than ever. It seemed too good to be true, but Queen Anne was desperate enough to consider even unlikely solutions. The meeting began with Blunt's masterful presentation of the company's business model. He'd prepared charts showing Spanish colonial wealth, maps illustrating trade routes, and financial projections demonstrating how modest access to South American markets could generate enormous profits. "Your Majesty," Blunt began, "Spain's South American colonies produce gold and silver worth approximately $2 million annually in European markets, but Spanish trade restrictions create artificial scarcity that inflates prices throughout Europe. British merchants pay premium rates for goods that could be purchased at production costs if we had direct access to colonial markets." The mathematics seemed compelling. If British traders could purchase South American goods at 30% of European prices and transport them efficiently, profit margins would approach 200% on successful voyages. Even accounting for transportation costs, trading risks and operational expenses, annual returns could easily reach 25 to 30%. Britain's national debt required approximately $500,000 annually for debt service. If the South Sea Company could generate $2 million annually from South American trade, they could cover debt obligations while providing substantial returns to shareholders. But Queen Anne had learned to be skeptical of financial projections that promised easy solutions to complex problems. "Mr. Blunt," she said, "your calculations assume Spanish cooperation with British commercial activities. Why would Spain abandon policies they've maintained for 2 centuries? What incentives do they have to grant us access to markets they've protected so carefully?" Blunt's response revealed the sophistication of his manipulation techniques. Instead of defending unrealistic assumptions, he reframed the question to focus on opportunities rather than obstacles. "Your Majesty raises the crucial point that makes our enterprise so valuable. Spain's colonial restrictions have indeed protected their trade monopoly, but they've also limited their own economic growth. Spanish colonial territories could support far more commercial activity than Spanish merchants alone can provide." Blunt produced maps showing Spanish colonial territories that were underdeveloped due to insufficient Spanish investment. He presented population estimates demonstrating that colonial markets could absorb far more imported goods than Spanish traders currently supplied. "The war has demonstrated Spanish military weakness and financial exhaustion. They need British cooperation for post-war reconstruction. More importantly, they need access to British manufactured goods that their colonies require for economic development." Blunt's argument was that Spanish colonial policy would change not from British pressure, but from Spanish recognition of mutual benefits that enhanced trade could provide. "We're offering Spain partnership rather than competition. British commercial expertise would develop colonial markets that generate increased revenues for Spanish authorities. British manufactured goods would improve colonial living standards that reduce Spanish administrative costs. British capital would finance colonial development that Spain cannot afford independently." This reframing transformed the South Sea Company from a scheme to exploit Spanish weakness into a proposal for mutually beneficial commercial cooperation. Queen Anne found this argument more persuasive than Blunt's initial presentations because it addressed her concerns about Spanish resistance while maintaining optimistic projections about profit potential. But the Queen's most important question concerned the relationship between the South Sea Company and existing British financial institutions. The Bank of England had been Britain's primary source of government credit since 1694. They held substantial government debt and had developed institutional expertise in managing large-scale financial operations. The East India Company controlled Britain's most profitable international trade and had experience with complex commercial enterprises in foreign territories. Why create a new institution rather than expanding existing operations through established financial partners? Harley's response revealed the political calculations that made the South Sea Company attractive to government officials beyond its business merits. The Bank of England was controlled by Whig politicians who opposed the Tory government's war and financial policies. Bank directors had repeatedly criticized government spending and demanded policy changes that would reduce their exposure to government default risk. The East India Company was focused on Asian trade that generated profits for shareholders rather than revenues for government operations. Their directors had resisted requests to assume additional government debt because it would divert capital from their profitable trading activities. Both institutions were financially independent of government control and politically aligned with opposition parties that sought to limit government power and spending. The South Sea Company would be different. As a new institution created by government charter, it would be inherently loyal to the government that granted its privileges. Company directors would be appointed with government approval and would have incentives to support government policies that protected company interests. Most importantly, the company's assumption of government debt would create permanent alignment between company success and government financial stability. Your Majesty, Harley explained, the South Sea Company would be more than a commercial enterprise. It would be an instrument of government policy that serves national interests rather than just private profits. This political dimension was crucial for Queen Anne because it offered a solution to Britain's debt crisis that would strengthen rather than constrain government authority. The Bank of England's lending came with conditions that limited government policy flexibility. Bank directors demanded spending restraint, tax increases, and economic policies that prioritized debt repayment over other government objectives. The South Sea Company would eliminate these external constraints by converting government debt into company equity that aligned creditor interests with government success, rather than creditor protection. Queen Anne authorized Harley and Blunt to develop legislation establishing the South Sea Company with the exclusive trading privileges they'd requested. But royal approval was only the first step in a complex political process that would require parliamentary authorization for the company's charter. Parliament in 1712 was deeply divided between Whig opposition that controlled the House of Lords and Tory government supporters, who held a slim majority in the House of Commons. The South Sea Company proposal would face intense scrutiny from Whig politicians who understood that company success would reduce Whig political leverage over government financial policy. Blunt had anticipated this political opposition and had developed strategies for managing parliamentary debates that demonstrated his understanding of legislative psychology. The key was framing the South Sea Company as a patriotic enterprise that served national interests rather than partisan political objectives. Company supporters would emphasize Britain's need for financial independence from foreign creditors, national security benefits from controlling South American trade routes, and economic advantages from accessing new markets. Opposition arguments focusing on business risks or financial complexity would be countered by appeals to British commercial superiority and national destiny. Skeptics would be portrayed as defeatists who lacked confidence in British capabilities. More importantly, Blunt had identified individual members of Parliament whose support could be purchased through favourable terms for company stock purchases. Parliamentary corruption in 1712 operated through informal arrangements that were difficult to detect, but enormously effective for influencing legislative outcomes. Company promoters would offer selected MPs opportunities to purchase shares at below-market prices, with favorable payment terms and guaranteed profits regardless of company performance. These arrangements weren't technically bribes because they involved legitimate business transactions, but they created financial incentives that aligned parliamentary votes with company interests. Blunt's political strategy combined public appeals to patriotism with private appeals to greed in ways that made opposition to the South Sea Company seem both unpatriotic and financially foolish. The parliamentary debates that followed revealed how effectively Blunt had managed the political dimensions of his scheme. Whig opponents raised legitimate questions about the company's business model, Spanish trading restrictions, and risks associated with converting government debt into corporate equity. But these technical arguments were overwhelmed by Tory supporters who framed the South Sea Company as essential for British economic independence and national security. More importantly, several key MPs who had initially expressed skepticism about the company suddenly became enthusiastic supporters after private meetings with Blunt and his associates. The South Sea Act received royal assent on September 10, 1712, establishing the South Sea Company with exclusive trading rights to Spanish America and authorization to assume $10 million in government debt. But royal and parliamentary approval was only the beginning of the South Sea Company's rise to power. The real test would be whether Blunt could maintain investor confidence in a business model that depended on Spanish cooperation that showed no signs of materializing. Spain had given no indication that they would abandon colonial trade restrictions. Peace treaty negotiations showed no progress toward the commercial concessions that the South Sea Company's business plan required. The company had government backing, exclusive trading privileges, and authorization to assume massive debt obligations. What they didn't have was any realistic prospect of generating the profits they'd promised to deliver. Blunt's challenge was transforming government authorization into market success without any underlying business substance to support investor optimism. His solution would create the largest financial bubble in history and establish techniques for market manipulation that continue to influence financial crimes today. Chapter 4. Share Mania Exchange Alley in the winter of 1719 had transformed from a narrow London street into the most dangerous place in the British Empire. Not because of criminals or violence, but because of something far more destructive: collective financial madness. By December, South Sea Company shares had reached $400, more than double their price from just 6 months earlier. Crowds of investors packed the coffeehouses where shares were traded, shouting orders and waving banknotes, with an hysteria that witnesses compared to religious revival meetings. But the real mania was only beginning. Jonathan's Coffee House, the unofficial headquarters of London stock trading, opened each morning to scenes that defied rational explanation. Merchants who'd spent decades building modest fortunes were risking everything on South Sea shares. Aristocrats were mortgaging ancestral estates to purchase stock. Even domestic servants were pooling their savings to buy fractional shares. The transformation had begun 6 months earlier when Spain finally signed the Treaty of Utrecht, ending the War of Spanish Succession. The treaty included a clause granting Britain limited trading rights to Spanish America. Exactly the development South Sea Company promoters had promised would validate their business model. But the actual terms fell far short of company promises. Britain gained the right to send one ship annually to Spanish colonial ports. This annual ship could carry 500 tons of cargo for trade with colonial merchants. British traders would also receive rights to supply enslaved Africans to Spanish colonies through what was called the Asiento Agreement. These concessions were valuable, but nowhere near sufficient to generate the profits the South Sea Company had promised. One ship annually couldn't produce revenues capable of servicing $10 million in government debt. The slave trade, while profitable, was also highly regulated and limited to specific quantities and destinations. Any rational analysis would have concluded that the treaty terms proved the South Sea Company's business model was fundamentally flawed. Instead, company promoters presented the treaty as complete vindication of their strategy. John Blunt organized a publicity campaign that portrayed the limited Spanish concessions as the beginning of unlimited British commercial expansion in South America. Company publications described the annual ship as establishing British presence that would inevitably lead to broader trading privileges. The asiento was presented as providing infrastructure for expanded commercial operations. More importantly, Blunt manipulated the release of information to maximize psychological impact on potential investors. Details about treaty terms were revealed gradually through carefully orchestrated announcements that emphasized positive developments while obscuring negative limitations. Company officials gave interviews to financial journalists that focused on future opportunities rather than current constraints. The result was a narrative that portrayed the South Sea Company as having solved their fundamental business challenge while maintaining enormous untapped potential for future growth. But narrative alone couldn't have created the mania that engulfed London's financial district. Blunt's real innovation was the subscription system that made South Sea shares accessible to ordinary investors who couldn't afford full purchase prices. Here's how it worked. Investors could purchase $1,000 worth of South Sea shares for $100 down payment, with the balance payable in 8 quarterly installments of $112.50. If share prices appreciated faster than installment payments came due, investors could sell their shares for profits that exceeded their total financial commitment. This system created leveraged speculation that magnified both potential gains and potential losses. An investor who paid $100 down for $1,000 worth of shares would earn $500 profit if share prices increased 50%. But they would lose their entire investment if share prices declined by just 10% because they wouldn't be able to complete their installment payments. The subscription system attracted investors who understood they were gambling rather than investing, but who believed that South Sea share prices would continue rising fast enough to guarantee profits. This belief was reinforced by the company's policy of regularly offering new subscription opportunities at prices above current market levels. When South Sea shares traded at $300, the company would announce new subscriptions available at $400 per share. This created artificial demand that drove market prices toward subscription prices, while suggesting that company officials expected continued price appreciation. Each new subscription attracted investors who feared missing opportunities for quick profits. Each price increase attracted additional speculators who interpreted rising prices as evidence of underlying value. The psychological dynamics were perfectly designed to create self-reinforcing optimism that became immune to contrary evidence. But the subscription system's real genius was how it created the illusion of democratic participation in financial success while concentrating actual wealth in the hands of company insiders. Ordinary investors paid installments for shares they hoped to sell at profits before completing their payments. They were essentially renting the right to participate in share price appreciation without actually owning significant company equity. Company insiders received shares through favorable arrangements that didn't require installment payments. They controlled large quantities of fully paid shares that they could sell at market peaks, while ordinary investors were still making payments on subscriptions. The result was a wealth transfer mechanism disguised as equal opportunity investment. By early 1720, this system had created market conditions that bordered on collective insanity. South Sea shares had reached $600 by March, 10 times their original price, and far above any valuation justified by actual business prospects. But instead of attracting skepticism, these price increases attracted even more speculative investment. Coffee houses throughout London displayed crude price charts showing South Sea appreciation that encouraged customers to believe that share prices would continue rising indefinitely. Newspapers published stories about ordinary investors who'd become wealthy through South Sea speculation. Most dangerously, the speculation was spreading beyond South Sea shares to dozens of other companies that promised similar profits from equally improbable ventures. The bubble companies that emerged in 1720 offered investment opportunities that ranged from merely optimistic to completely absurd. Companies promised profits from draining Irish bogs, extracting silver from lead, manufacturing square cannonballs, and carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. That last company, which actually existed and successfully sold shares, collected $2,000 from investors for a business venture that its promoter refused to describe. The promoter disappeared with the money the day after the subscription closed, yet investors continued funding similarly preposterous schemes because South Sea success had convinced them that traditional business analysis was irrelevant in the new financial environment. The bubble had created its own logic that replaced rational calculation with psychological momentum. Investors stopped evaluating companies based on their business prospects and started evaluating them based on their potential for share price appreciation. Companies stopped developing realistic business plans and started developing marketing strategies designed to attract speculative investment. The entire financial system was transforming from a mechanism for funding productive business activities into a gambling system where paper profits were generated by rising prices rather than actual value creation. But the most dangerous development was the spread of speculation to ordinary households that had no experience with financial markets. Domestic servants were mortgaging their future wages to purchase shares. Craftsmen were selling their tools to raise capital for speculation. Farmers were borrowing against their land to participate in what everyone assured them was a guaranteed path to wealth. These amateur investors lacked the financial knowledge to evaluate investment risks or the capital reserves to survive losses. They were risking their entire economic security based on promises from people who understood market manipulation far better than the victims they were targeting. The social consequences of this mass speculation were becoming visible throughout British society. Traditional economic relationships were breaking down as employers competed with stock speculation for workers' attention and loyalty. Apprentices were abandoning skilled trades for get-rich-quick schemes that promised faster advancement than years of training. Young people were refusing marriages they couldn't afford while planning weddings financed by expected stock profits. Most ominously, credit relationships that formed the foundation of commercial activity were being distorted by speculation fever. Merchants were extending credit to customers planning to repay from stock profits rather than business income. Banks were accepting stock shares as collateral for loans without properly evaluating the underlying value of that collateral. Landlords were accepting delayed rent payments from tenants who promised repayment after selling their shares. The entire British economy was becoming dependent on continued appreciation of stock prices that bore no relationship to actual economic productivity. By summer 1720, South Sea shares had reached over $1,000, an increase of more than 900% in less than 2 years. The company's market capitalization exceeded the value of all land in Britain, but the fundamental business problems that had made the South Sea Company a questionable investment in 1711 remained completely unresolved in 1720. The company still had no significant trade operations in South America. Spanish authorities continued restricting British commercial access to levels that couldn't support the company's financial obligations. The annual ship had generated modest profits that were dwarfed by the company's massive debt service requirements. What had changed wasn't the company's business prospects, but the public's willingness to ignore business reality in favor of speculation fever. The South Sea bubble had reached the point where its continuation depended not on company performance, but on maintaining public confidence in unlimited price appreciation. And that confidence was about to face its first serious challenge. Chapter 5. Political Corruption. The secret meeting that would expose the true nature of the South Sea scheme took place in Chancellor John Aislaby's private study on April 15, 1720. Present were Aislaby himself, South Sea Company Director John Blunt, and Sir George Caswall, a Member of Parliament who controlled crucial votes in the House of Commons. The meeting's purpose was discussing terms for Caswall's support of new legislation that would allow the South Sea Company to assume even more government debt, potentially doubling the size of their financial obligations and their exclusive trading privileges. But the conversation that followed revealed something far more sinister: systematic corruption that reached the highest levels of British government. "Gentlemen," Aislaby began, "the company's continued success requires parliamentary support for expanded operations. Sir George's influence could prove decisive in securing favourable legislation." What happened next was a negotiation that transformed legitimate political advocacy into criminal conspiracy. Blunt offered Caswell the opportunity to purchase $50,000 worth of South Sea shares at $200 per share, less than half the current market price of $450. The shares would be paid for through company loans that required no collateral and carried no specified repayment schedule. In exchange, Caswell would ensure that key parliamentary committees received favorable reports about the company's business prospects and would organize voting coalitions that supported expanded company privileges. This wasn't unusual political horse trading. It was bribery disguised as investment opportunity, but Caswell's arrangement was just one example of systematic corruption that had infected British government at every level. Aislabie himself had received $27,000 worth of company shares through similar arrangements. Treasury officials responsible for evaluating the company's financial proposals had been granted favorable share purchase opportunities. Even clerks who processed government paperwork had received small amounts of company stock as gratuities for expediting company business. The South Sea Company had effectively purchased the British government's financial oversight function. But the corruption extended beyond simple bribery to include more sophisticated forms of influence that were nearly impossible to detect or prosecute. Company directors had provided government officials with investment advice that helped them profit from other stock speculation. They'd arranged favorable business deals for officials' family members. They'd offered prestigious social opportunities that enhanced officials' personal and political standing. Most insidiously, they'd created financial relationships that made government officials dependent on continued company success for their personal prosperity. Officials who owned substantial amounts of company stock had obvious incentives to support policies that maintained high stock prices. Officials whose family members had benefited from company-arranged business opportunities would be reluctant to investigate company operations too closely. The result was a government that was institutionally incapable of providing independent oversight of the South Sea Company's activities. But this corruption wasn't motivated solely by personal greed. Many government officials genuinely believed that the South Sea Company's success was essential for British financial stability and that supporting the company served national interests as well as personal advantage. This sincere conviction made the corruption more dangerous because it eliminated the moral constraints that might have limited officials' willingness to compromise their institutional responsibilities. Consider Chancellor Aislabie's position. His job required evaluating whether the South Sea Company's proposals would benefit British finances, but he also owned company stock worth more than 10 years of his official salary. He believed that company success would eliminate Britain's debt crisis and strengthen the British economy. In this context, supporting company interests seemed both personally profitable and patriotically necessary. Aislabie convinced himself that his stock ownership aligned his personal interests with national interests rather than creating conflicts that compromised his official judgment. Similar rationalizations were operating throughout British government as officials found reasons to believe that what benefited them financially also benefited the country politically. The corruption was also facilitated by the complexity of the South Sea Company's financial structure, which made it difficult for even honest officials to evaluate whether company proposals were genuinely beneficial. Government debt conversion involved intricate calculations about interest rates, risk assessments, and long-term financial projections that few officials fully understood. Company officials were the primary source of information about these technical matters, giving them enormous influence over government decisions. Officials who wanted to make informed decisions had to rely on information provided by the same company whose proposals they were supposed to evaluate independently. This information asymmetry allowed company representatives to shape government understanding of financial issues in ways that supported company interests while maintaining the appearance of objective technical analysis. But the most dangerous aspect of the corruption was how it created positive feedback loops that made exposure and correction increasingly unlikely as the scheme grew larger. Each new government official who accepted company benefits became invested in protecting the company from investigation. Each expansion of company operations increased the number of people whose prosperity depended on continued company success. By 1720, so many government officials had financial stakes in the South Sea Company that investigating company operations would have required investigating the financial affairs of a substantial portion of the British government. The corruption had become too widespread to expose without triggering a political crisis that could destabilize the entire government. This protection from investigation allowed company officials to escalate their manipulation strategies without fear of government interference. The most brazen example was the company's relationship with King George III himself. In June 1720, company officials arranged for the king to be appointed governor of the South Sea Company, a ceremonial position that came with substantial financial compensation and implied royal endorsement of company operations. Royal involvement made criticism of the South Sea Company potentially treasonous, while providing company marketing with the ultimate credibility endorsement. Company publications began featuring royal testimonials about the company's business prospects and patriotic mission. Stock subscription announcements emphasized royal participation as evidence of investment security. The monarchy had become a marketing tool for stock manipulation. But the king's involvement also revealed the international dimension of the corruption that was spreading beyond Britain to influence European political relationships. King George III was also Elector of Hanover, giving him interests in German political affairs that could be influenced by financial relationships with British commercial enterprises. South Sea Company's success enhanced British financial power that strengthened the king's position in European politics. Company profits provided resources that could be used to advance Hanoverian interests in German territorial disputes. The king had personal and political incentives to support the South Sea Company that went beyond his direct financial stake in company stock. This international dimension was important because it meant that exposing South Sea corruption would potentially damage British diplomatic relationships and European political stability. Foreign governments had their own financial stakes in British economic success that made them reluctant to investigate or criticize questionable British financial practices. The corruption had become too internationally integrated to address through domestic British political processes alone. By summer 1720, the South Sea Company had achieved something unprecedented in European history. They had corrupted an entire government so thoroughly that the government had lost the ability to regulate or oversee their operations. Company officials could manipulate stock prices without fear of government intervention. They could make promises to investors without concern about government requirements that promises be fulfilled. They could expand their operations into new areas without obtaining proper regulatory approval. The South Sea Company had become a financial enterprise that operated beyond effective government control while maintaining government endorsement of their activities. But this freedom from oversight was creating risks that company officials themselves didn't fully understand. Without external constraints, company operations were becoming increasingly detached from business reality. Stock manipulation was replacing actual business development. Financial engineering was substituting for genuine value creation. The company was becoming successful at generating paper profits while failing at every measure of actual business performance. This disconnect between financial success and business reality was creating unsustainable conditions that would eventually force a reckoning between market valuations and underlying value. But for now, the corruption had created a protective environment where company officials could continue their manipulation strategies without effective opposition from the institutions that should have been providing oversight and regulation. The South Sea Company had achieved the ultimate corruption. They had turned government regulation into government promotion of their fraudulent activities. The consequences of this corruption would soon become visible as the gap between stock prices and business reality grew too large to be sustained by even the most sophisticated manipulation techniques. Chapter 6. Market Manipulation. The trading floor at Jonathan's Coffee House on the morning of June 24, 1720, resembled a battlefield more than a financial market. Merchants, clerks, and speculators crowded around crude wooden tables where South Sea shares were changing hands at prices that defied every principle of rational valuation. But hidden in this apparent chaos was the most sophisticated market manipulation scheme ever devised. South Sea Company directors weren't passive observers of their stock's meteoric rise. They were orchestrating every dramatic price movement through techniques that wouldn't be seen again until the development of modern financial fraud. John Blunt stood in the center of the trading floor, ostensibly monitoring market conditions, but actually directing a complex operation involving dozens of confederates who were executing coordinated trades designed to create artificial price momentum. Here's how the manipulation worked. Company officials had established accounts with multiple stockbrokers under false names and through intermediaries who concealed the true identity of the account holders. These accounts allowed company insiders to trade their own stock without revealing that the trades were being directed by company management. When company officials wanted to drive share prices higher, they would coordinate simultaneous purchase orders through multiple accounts. The appearance of heavy buying pressure from numerous independent sources would convince other traders that genuine demand was increasing, triggering additional purchases that drove prices even higher. When officials wanted to sell shares at peak prices, they would first spread rumors about positive company developments that attracted outside buyers. Then, they would sell their shares into the artificially inflated demand while maintaining the appearance of continued optimism about company prospects. The sophistication of this manipulation was breathtaking. Company officials weren't just manipulating prices, they were manipulating the information that other traders used to make decisions about buying or selling. Consider what happened during the Spanish expedition announcement of May 1720. Company publications suddenly began featuring stories about secret negotiations with Spanish authorities that would dramatically expand British trading privileges in South America. These stories were presented as leaked information from confidential diplomatic sources. The stories were completely fabricated, but they were crafted with enough specific detail to seem credible to investors who lacked access to actual diplomatic intelligence. More importantly, the stories were timed to coincide with coordinated purchasing that created the appearance of informed investor response to positive developments. Professional traders who observed heavy buying activity simultaneous with positive news announcements concluded that well-informed investors were acting on reliable information about company prospects. This conclusion triggered additional buying that drove share prices from 890 to 1,050 in 3 trading days. Company insiders then sold massive quantities of shares during the price surge, while continuing to publish optimistic assessments of company business prospects. But the manipulation wasn't limited to false information and coordinated trading. Company officials had also developed techniques for managing the psychological environment that influenced investor decision-making. The subscription system that made shares accessible to ordinary investors was designed not just to democratize investment, but to create psychological pressure that discouraged rational analysis. Subscription offerings were announced with artificial time limits that created urgency pressure. Limited time opportunities convinced potential investors that they needed to make immediate decisions without adequate research. Subscription terms were presented in complex formats that made it difficult for ordinary investors to calculate actual costs and risks. Multiple payment schedules, varying interest rates, and conditional clauses created confusion that favored company interests. Most importantly, subscription announcements emphasized the success of previous subscribers who had profited from earlier offerings. These success stories created social pressure, where not participating seemed like missing obvious opportunities for financial advancement. The company had transformed stock investment from a business decision based on financial analysis into a social phenomenon driven by fear of exclusion from collective prosperity. But the most dangerous manipulation technique involved the company's relationship with financial journalists and opinion leaders who shaped public understanding of market conditions. South Sea Company officials had identified the small number of influential writers whose opinions were widely read by potential investors. They provided these opinion leaders with exclusive access to company information, favorable terms for stock purchases, and direct financial payments for positive coverage. The result was systematic bias in financial reporting that presented company operations in the most favorable possible terms while suppressing negative information that might have encouraged skepticism. Journalists who had been granted favorable stock purchase arrangements had personal financial incentives to write positively about company prospects. Writers who owned company stock naturally emphasized developments that supported their investment decisions. Even journalists who maintained professional independence found it difficult to obtain reliable information about company operations because the company controlled access to the data that would have been necessary for independent analysis. The manipulation had created an information environment where potential investors received systematically distorted assessments of investment risks and opportunities. But perhaps the most ingenious manipulation involved the company's use of the subscription system to create artificial scarcity that inflated demand beyond any rational level. Each new subscription offering was announced as oversubscribed before the subscription period officially opened. This created the impression that demand for company shares exceeded available supply, encouraging potential investors to compete for limited opportunities. In reality, company officials were controlling both supply and demand through their coordination of subscription offerings with trading activities. They would announce new subscriptions when market conditions were favorable for generating maximum investor interest. They would limit subscription quantities to create artificial scarcity. They would ensure that subscriptions sold out quickly through coordinated purchases by company confederates. The appearance of overwhelming demand would then attract additional investors who interpreted subscription success as evidence of genuine value. But the scarcity was completely artificial, because company officials could create new subscription offerings whenever they chose to do so. The company was essentially printing money by selling shares in a business that had no realistic prospect of generating the profits necessary to justify the prices investors were paying. By July 1720, these manipulation techniques had driven South Sea share prices to over $1,000, more than 1,000% above their original value and far beyond any conceivable business valuation. The company's market capitalization exceeded the combined value of all other companies trading on London exchanges. Individual investors had committed fortunes to an enterprise that existed primarily on paper. But the manipulation had created unsustainable market conditions that required increasingly extreme measures to maintain artificial price levels. Each new price increase required more coordinated buying to maintain momentum. Each subscription offering needed to be larger and more attractive than previous offerings to maintain investor interest. Each positive announcement needed to promise greater opportunities than previous announcements to maintain credibility. Company officials were trapped in an escalation cycle where maintaining their fraud required constantly expanding the scope and scale of their manipulation activities. More dangerously, the success of South Sea manipulation had inspired dozens of imitators who were using similar techniques to promote equally questionable investment opportunities. The London stock market in summer 1720 featured over 200 different companies, offering investment opportunities that ranged from optimistic to completely absurd. Most of these bubble companies were using South Sea manipulation techniques without the government connections and financial resources that made South Sea operations sustainable. The proliferation of bubble companies was creating market conditions where obvious fraud was becoming normalized and rational skepticism was becoming socially unacceptable. Investors who questioned unrealistic business proposals were dismissed as lacking vision or understanding of new economic opportunities. Financial analysis that focused on actual business fundamentals was considered old-fashioned and irrelevant to modern investment strategies. The manipulation had created a collective delusion that traditional business principles no longer applied to financial markets. But this delusion was being sustained only through increasingly desperate manipulation techniques that were becoming more visible to observers who retained some capacity for rational analysis. The gap between stock prices and underlying business value was growing so large that maintaining artificial price levels required market intervention that bordered on the impossible. Company officials were discovering that successful market manipulation created its own momentum that eventually became impossible to control or sustain. The South Sea bubble was approaching the point where even the most sophisticated manipulation techniques would be insufficient to prevent market forces from reasserting the relationship between price and value. Chapter 7. Peak Madness. London in August 1720 had become a city possessed by collective insanity. South Sea Company shares reached $1,050 on August 18th, a price that valued the company at more than the entire British national economy. But instead of triggering skepticism, this milestone attracted even more frenzied speculation. The scenes outside Exchange Alley defied rational description. Crowds of would-be investors camped overnight hoping to secure opportunities to purchase shares at any price. Fights broke out over access to stockbrokers. Women sold jewelry on the street to raise capital for stock purchases. Children were sent to hold places in lines while their parents arranged financing. But the madness wasn't confined to ordinary speculators. Britain's most sophisticated financial minds had also succumbed to the collective delusion that South Sea shares represented guaranteed wealth. Sir Isaac Newton, perhaps the greatest scientific mind in human history, had initially profited from South Sea speculation by purchasing shares early and selling them at a substantial gain. But watching continued price increases convinced him that he'd made a mistake by selling too soon. Newton re-entered the market in July 1720, purchasing $20,000 worth of South Sea shares at prices near their peak. When asked about his investment strategy, Newton reportedly said, "I can calculate the movement of stars, but not the madness of men." The irony was devastating. The man who had discovered the laws governing planetary motion couldn't resist financial speculation that violated every principle of rational analysis. Newton's experience illustrated how the bubble had created psychological conditions that overwhelmed even exceptional intelligence and experience. The crucial factor was social proof, the human tendency to assume that widespread behavior must be rational even when individual analysis suggests otherwise. When thousands of intelligent, successful people were investing their fortunes in South Sea shares, questioning the wisdom of such investments seemed arrogant and foolish. The consensus of crowd behavior appeared more reliable than individual skepticism. This social proof was reinforced by confirmation bias that filtered information to support decisions people had already made or wanted to make. Investors who owned South Sea shares paid attention to positive news about the company. While ignoring negative developments, they interpreted price increases as validation of their investment wisdom while dismissing price declines as temporary setbacks. Most dangerously, they began treating unrealized paper profits as actual wealth that justified additional risk-taking and spending. Families were planning major purchases based on their expected profits from South Sea shares. Young people were arranging marriages they couldn't afford based on their anticipated stock gains. Businesses were expanding operations they couldn't finance based on owners' projected investment returns. The entire British economy was becoming structured around stock appreciation that existed only on paper. But the peak madness was most visible in the proliferation of bubble companies that offered investment opportunities so absurd they seemed like satire of legitimate business ventures. The company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is, actually sold $2,000 worth of shares before its promoter disappeared with the money. Investors purchased shares in companies promising to extract sunbeams from cucumbers, transmute base metals into gold, and establish perpetual motion machines. A company promoting the draining of the Red Sea to recover treasure lost when Pharaoh's army drowned attracted serious investment from educated professionals who should have recognized the obvious impossibility of the proposal. These bubble companies succeeded not because investors believed their business plans were realistic, but because investors had lost the ability to distinguish between realistic and unrealistic investment opportunities. The South Sea Company's success had established a new investment logic where stock price appreciation was more important than business fundamentals. If shares increased in value, the underlying business must be sound, regardless of what rational analysis suggested. This perverted logic was encouraged by financial advisors who had abandoned traditional investment principles in favor of speculation strategies that promised quick wealth. Stockbrokers were encouraging clients to borrow money to purchase shares because rising prices would generate profits that exceeded borrowing costs. Banks were accepting stock shares as collateral for loans without properly evaluating whether the collateral value was sustainable. Financial professionals who should have provided voice of reason were instead feeding the speculation bubble because their own prosperity depended on continued market activity. But the most dangerous development was the spread of speculation to ordinary households that lacked financial sophistication or capital reserves to survive significant losses. Domestic servants were investing their entire life savings in bubble company shares. Craftsmen were borrowing against their tools and workshops to participate in stock speculation. Rural families were mortgaging their farms to purchase shares in companies they didn't understand. These amateur investors were making financial decisions based on stories of spectacular profits rather than analysis of investment risks. They were treating stock speculation like lottery purchases rather than business investments. The social consequences were becoming visible throughout British society as traditional economic relationships broke down under speculation pressure. Employers couldn't maintain reliable workforces because employees were distracted by stock trading. Apprentices were abandoning skilled trades for get-rich-quick schemes. Young people were refusing to learn practical skills because they expected stock profits to eliminate the need for conventional employment. Marriage relationships were being strained as spouses disagreed about family financial decisions. Parents were investing money needed for children's education in stock speculation. Adult children were pressuring elderly relatives to sell property to finance stock purchases. The speculation bubble was destroying social institutions that had provided economic stability for generations. But perhaps the most ominous development was the relationship between stock speculation and government policy. Politicians were making financial decisions based on their personal stock holdings rather than objective analysis of national interests. Government policies were being shaped by the need to maintain stock prices rather than sound economic principles. The Treasury was delaying debt repayments to avoid market disruptions that might affect stock prices. The Bank of England was providing loans to support stock speculation rather than productive business activity. Parliament was considering legislation that would benefit bubble companies rather than addressing genuine economic needs. The British government was becoming subordinate to stock market dynamics rather than maintaining independent authority over economic policy. By late August 1720, the bubble had created market conditions so detached from economic reality that even company insiders were beginning to recognize that the situation was unsustainable. John Blunt privately admitted to associates that South Sea share prices had reached levels that couldn't be justified by any conceivable business performance. Company financial projections showed that even perfect execution of their business plans couldn't generate profits sufficient to justify current stock valuations. But company officials were trapped by the success of their own manipulation. They couldn't reveal the truth about company prospects without destroying their stock price. They couldn't reduce their manipulation activities without triggering market collapse. They couldn't escape their positions without massive public exposure of their fraud. The manipulation had become a prison that confined the manipulators as much as their victims. More importantly, market conditions were becoming so extreme that external factors beyond company control were beginning to threaten bubble stability. Interest rates were rising as the Bank of England struggled to maintain monetary policy independence. Agricultural harvests were disappointing, creating inflationary pressure that reduced disposable income available for speculation. International trade disruptions were affecting the broader economy in ways that made continued speculation difficult to sustain. The South Sea bubble had reached the point where its continuation depended not just on maintaining investor confidence, but on preventing any external economic developments that might force investors to focus on financial reality rather than speculation fantasy. That combination of factors was becoming impossible to control through even the most sophisticated manipulation techniques. The peak madness was about to collide with market forces that no amount of financial engineering could overcome. Chapter 8. The Crash. The first crack appeared on August 31, 1720, in an unlikely place, a small notice buried in the London Gazette announcing that several bubble companies had been declared illegal under anti-monopoly laws. The companies involved were minor players with minimal market impact. Under normal circumstances, Their legal troubles would have attracted little attention from serious investors focused on major enterprises like the South Sea Company. But market psychology in 1720 was far from normal. After months of relentless optimism, where every development was interpreted as proof of continued prosperity, any negative news triggered disproportionate anxiety. Investors who had been ignoring obvious warning signs suddenly became hypersensitive to potential threats. The legal action against bubble companies wasn't important in itself, but it reminded speculators that government authorities might eventually scrutinize investment schemes that seemed too good to be true. South Sea shares dropped from $1,050 to $950 in 2 days of trading, a decline of less than 10%, but the first significant price decrease in over 6 months. John Blunt recognized the danger immediately. Market psychology that had created the bubble through collective optimism could destroy it through collective pessimism. Once investors started questioning whether prices could continue rising indefinitely, the assumptions that supported speculation would collapse. Blunt's response demonstrated both his sophistication and his desperation. Instead of trying to arrest the decline through normal market operations, he launched the most audacious manipulation attempt of his career. On September 8th, the South Sea Company announced that they were prepared to lend money to investors who wanted to purchase company shares. The company would provide loans equal to 75% of share purchase prices at interest rates of just 5% annually. This was financial suicide disguised as customer service. The company was offering to finance purchases of their own stock, using money that existed only as long as their stock price remained inflated. They were betting their survival on their ability to maintain artificial price levels through loans that would become worthless if prices declined significantly. But the announcement had its intended effect. Share prices recovered to over $1,000 as investors interpreted company willingness to finance share purchases as evidence of management confidence in continued appreciation. The recovery lasted exactly 11 days. On September 19th, the Bank of England announced that they were restricting credit availability to prevent excessive speculation from destabilizing the monetary system. Banks would no longer provide loans secured by bubble company shares. Existing loans would need to be repaid or secured by alternative collateral. This policy change was financially sensible and long overdue, but its timing was catastrophic for speculation markets. Thousands of investors had purchased shares using borrowed money that was suddenly being called due. They faced a choice: sell shares to repay loans or lose both their shares and their credit relationships. The forced selling began immediately. Share prices dropped 20% in the first day as leveraged investors liquidated their positions. The decline accelerated as each round of selling triggered additional margin calls that forced more selling. South Sea shares fell from $1,000 to $600 in 5 trading days. But the real catastrophe wasn't the price decline. It was the psychological reversal that transformed months of greed-driven buying into panic-driven selling. Investors who had been mortgaging their homes to purchase shares were now selling everything they owned to minimize losses. Families who had planned their futures around expected stock profits were facing bankruptcy. Business owners who had invested operating capital were confronting the possibility of losing their enterprises. The human drama was heartbreaking. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu wrote to her sister, "The general conversation is of nothing but South Sea, and that with so much warmth and concern that it has something in it very moving. You can't go into any coffee house without hearing the most dreadful stories of sudden beggary and unexpected riches. But individual tragedies were just the beginning of a broader economic collapse." The speculation bubble had created artificial credit relationships throughout the British economy. Merchants had extended credit to customers expecting repayment from stock profits. Banks had made loans secured by stock shares. Landlords had accepted rent deferrals from tenants, planning to pay from investment gains. When stock prices collapsed, these credit relationships collapsed simultaneously. Customers couldn't repay merchant credit because their stock wealth had vanished. Banks faced massive losses on loans secured by worthless collateral. Landlords discovered that promised rent payments were impossible because tenants had no assets to liquidate. The credit crisis spread beyond stock speculation to affect every sector of the economy. Manufacturing businesses couldn't obtain loans for normal operations because banks were restricting credit to preserve capital. Agricultural producers couldn't finance seasonal activities because lending institutions faced uncertainty about their own solvency. International trade ground to a halt as commercial credit disappeared. Britain was experiencing its first modern financial crisis, a systematic breakdown of credit relationships that paralyzed economic activity beyond the specific markets where the original speculation had occurred. But the crisis was also revealing the true extent of corruption that had made the bubble possible. As South Sea Company stock became worthless, investigators began examining the favorable share purchase arrangements that had been granted to government officials. Parliamentary inquiries discovered systematic bribery that reached the highest levels of British government. Chancellor John Aislabie was found to have received company shares worth $27,000 through arrangements that violated his fiduciary responsibilities. Treasury officials had accepted bribes disguised as investment opportunities. Members of Parliament had sold their votes in exchange for preferential stock purchase terms. The corruption investigation revealed that the British government had been effectively purchased by the South Sea Company through financial arrangements that compromised every institution responsible for protecting public interests. But the most devastating discovery was that company officials had been systematically selling their own shares while encouraging public investment in the same stock. John Blunt had sold over $300,000 worth of South Sea shares during the final months of the bubble, while publicly proclaiming his confidence in continued price appreciation. Other company directors had liquidated their positions at peak prices, while their public statements encouraged ordinary investors to increase their holdings. The South Sea Company leadership had been conducting a massive theft disguised as legitimate business operations. They had used their positions as company officials to manipulate stock prices upward through false announcements and coordinated trading. They had sold their shares at artificially inflated prices to investors who trusted their public statements about company prospects. Then they had allowed the bubble to collapse, while ordinary investors faced the financial consequences of believing the lies company officials had told. But perhaps the most shocking revelation was how close the fraud had come to achieving its original objective. Government debt that had seemed impossible to manage in 1711 had actually been eliminated through the debt-to-equity conversion that formed the foundation of the South Sea scheme. The British government no longer owed $10 million to creditors because that debt had been exchanged for South Sea Company shares. Investors who had lost fortunes in the stock collapse had effectively provided debt forgiveness that solved Britain's fiscal crisis. The scheme had worked exactly as designed. It had transferred Britain's debt burden from the government to private investors who were left holding worthless paper while the government's financial obligations disappeared. The South Sea bubble wasn't just a speculative collapse. It was a successful theft of the British national debt that left ordinary citizens paying for government financial mismanagement through their personal losses. By November 1720, South Sea shares were trading at less than $200, a decline of over 80% from their peak. Thousands of families had been ruined, multiple banks had failed, several suicide cases were attributed to speculation losses. But the worst consequence was political. Public trust in British financial institutions had been destroyed, faith in government integrity had been shattered, confidence in market-based economic systems had been eliminated. The South Sea bubble had created the first modern financial crisis and established that economic catastrophe could result from systematic fraud by the most trusted institutions in society. The collapse was complete, but its consequences were just beginning. Chapter 9. Mass Ruin. The suicide note found beside Thomas Guy's body on October 12, 1720, contained just 7 words. South Sea shares, nothing left, forgive me. Guy had been a successful bookseller who built a comfortable fortune over 30 years of careful business management. In March 1720, convinced by friends that South Sea investment was essential for financial security, he had sold his printing business and invested everything in company shares at $800 each. By October, those shares were worth $180. Guy's life savings of $15,000 had become $3,275. not enough to support himself, let alone repay the debts he'd incurred to increase his investment when prices were rising. Guy's tragedy was repeated thousands of times across Britain as the full scale of the South Sea catastrophe became visible. The human cost was staggering. Contemporary estimates suggested that over 100,000 people had invested in South Sea shares, roughly 2% of Britain's total population. Most had lost 70–90% of their investment value. Many faced complete financial ruin, but the raw numbers couldn't capture the social devastation that the collapse had created. Entire families that had accumulated wealth over generations found themselves penniless overnight. The Earl of Sunderland lost an estimated $50,000, equivalent to millions in modern currency. The Duke of Chandos saw his fortune reduced from $300,000 to less than $30,000. If titled nobility could face such catastrophic losses, imagine the impact on ordinary investors who lacked comparable resources. James Milner, a London clockmaker, had mortgaged his workshop and tools to purchase South Sea shares for his daughter's dowry. When the bubble collapsed, Milner lost both his business and his daughter's marriage prospects. The family was reduced to seeking charity from former customers. Sarah Pemberton, a widow who had invested her husband's life insurance payment in South Sea stock, found herself unable to pay rent on the modest rooms she shared with her 3 children. Evicted in November 1720, the family spent the winter in a workhouse. These personal tragedies were multiplied throughout British society as the speculation collapse triggered secondary economic effects that damaged even people who had never owned stock. Businesses that had extended credit to customers expecting repayment from stock profits faced massive bad debt losses. Shops that had accepted IOUs from customers planning to pay after selling shares discovered that those promises were worthless. Employment opportunities disappeared as companies reduced operations to preserve capital. Construction projects were cancelled as developers couldn't obtain financing. Luxury trades like jewelry making and fine clothing collapsed as their wealthy customers faced financial ruin. The speculation bubble had created economic interdependencies that made the stock market collapse everyone's problem regardless of their personal involvement in speculation. But perhaps the most tragic aspect was how the collapse affected families that had made reasonable financial decisions. The Hartwell family had resisted speculation fever throughout 1720, maintaining their savings in traditional investments and refusing to risk money on dubious stock schemes. But Mr. Hartwell's employer, a merchant who had speculated heavily, was forced to close his business and dismiss his workers. The Hartwells found themselves unemployed through no fault of their own, victims of someone else's poor judgment, but facing the same financial consequences as if they had speculated themselves. This pattern was repeated throughout the economy, as the interconnected nature of commercial relationships meant that speculation losses affected entire communities rather than just individual speculators. Rural areas experienced particular hardship because agricultural communities had limited economic diversification to cushion the impact of financial crisis. Farmers who had mortgaged their land to participate in stock speculation faced foreclosure when they couldn't meet debt payments. Agricultural workers lost employment as farm operations reduced expenses. Rural merchants who had provided credit to farming communities faced bankruptcy as their customers defaulted on obligations. Entire villages experienced economic collapse as the financial crisis spread through local credit relationships and employment networks. The government's response to this mass suffering revealed both the limitations of 18th century social policy and the political priorities that had enabled the bubble in the first place. Parliament established a committee to investigate South Sea Company fraud and recover assets that could be used to compensate victims, but the investigation focused on prosecuting obvious criminal behavior rather than addressing the systematic policy failures that had made the fraud possible. Several company directors were imprisoned and their estates confiscated. John Blunt was stripped of his wealth and banned from holding corporate office. Chancellor Aislabie was expelled from Parliament and faced criminal charges. These prosecutions satisfied public demand for justice, but recovered only a fraction of the money that investors had lost. More importantly, the investigation carefully avoided examining the government corruption that had enabled the fraud or the policy decisions that had allowed such extreme speculation to develop. Government officials who had received bribes faced minimal consequences compared to company officials who had paid those bribes. Parliamentary procedures that had allowed fraudulent legislation to be passed without proper oversight remained unchanged. The investigation treated the South Sea bubble as an isolated criminal conspiracy rather than a systematic failure of government regulation and oversight. This limited response meant that many of the conditions that had made the bubble possible remained in place, creating risks for future financial crises. But the most lasting damage was psychological. The South Sea collapse had shattered British confidence in financial institutions and market-based economic activity. A generation of investors had learned that stock markets could be manipulated by insiders who understood complex financial techniques better than ordinary participants. They had discovered that government officials could be corrupted by business interests that had incentives to exploit public trust. Most importantly, they had experienced how quickly paper wealth could disappear when market psychology shifted from optimism to pessimism. This psychological damage influenced British economic behavior for decades. Investment in joint stock companies remained limited because investors feared another bubble collapse. Government debt instruments were viewed with suspicion because of their connection to the South Sea fraud. British capital markets didn't fully recover from South Sea trauma until the 1760s, over 40 years after the original collapse. The crisis also influenced British political development by reinforcing skepticism about concentrations of financial power and government relationships with private business interests. Parliament passed legislation restricting the formation of joint stock companies and requiring government oversight of corporate charters. Banking regulations were strengthened to prevent excessive speculation and credit expansion. But these reforms couldn't undo the damage that had already been inflicted on thousands of families whose lives had been destroyed by the greatest financial fraud in British history. The South Sea bubble had proven that sophisticated financial manipulation could transfer enormous wealth from ordinary citizens to privileged insiders while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activity. More ominously, it had demonstrated that government institutions designed to protect public interests could be corrupted by private interests that understood financial complexity better than the officials responsible for oversight. The mass ruin created by the South Sea collapse wasn't just a financial catastrophe. It was evidence that democratic societies could be vulnerable to systematic theft by individuals who combined financial expertise with political influence. The lessons of mass ruin would influence British economic and political development for generations, but they would also be forgotten and repeated in future financial crises that followed similar patterns of manipulation, corruption, and collapse. Chapter 10. Government Collapse. The motion for no confidence in His Majesty's government was introduced in the House of Commons on December 3, 1720, by Sir William Windham, with words that would echo through British political history. This House has lost confidence in ministers who have betrayed the nation's trust through corruption, incompetence, and criminal conspiracy with fraudulent enterprises. The South Sea bubble's collapse had done more than destroy individual fortunes. It had triggered the most serious political crisis in British constitutional history. Public anger over the fraud had reached revolutionary levels. Crowds gathered daily outside Parliament, demanding arrests of government officials who had enabled the scheme. Pamphlets circulated calling for the execution of corrupt ministers. Street demonstrations threatened to escalate into organized rebellion if justice wasn't delivered. But the political crisis went beyond popular outrage to include fundamental questions about how democratic government could function when elected officials could be purchased by business interests. The parliamentary investigation into South Sea corruption had revealed systematic bribery that compromised virtually every level of government decision-making. Ministers had accepted company stock in exchange for favorable legislation. Treasury officials had received financial benefits for expediting company business. Members of Parliament had sold their votes for preferential investment opportunities. This wasn't isolated corruption by individual officials. It was systematic purchase of government authority by a business enterprise that had subordinated public policy to private profit. The constitutional implications were staggering. If business interests could buy government decisions through sophisticated financial arrangements, what remained of democratic accountability and popular sovereignty? King George III faced the most serious challenge to royal authority since the English Civil War. Public anger focused not just on corrupt ministers, but on the monarchy itself for failing to prevent systematic fraud that had devastated the national economy. The king's personal involvement with the South Sea Company, as their ceremonial governor, had compromised royal authority in ways that threatened the legitimacy of the entire political system. Opposition politicians demanded the king's abdication for betraying his constitutional responsibility to protect his subjects from fraudulent schemes. Republican pamphlets circulated arguing that hereditary monarchy was inherently incapable of preventing corruption because royal interests could be aligned with business interests against popular welfare. For the first time since 1688, serious political figures were questioning whether Britain should remain a monarchy or adopt republican government that would be more responsive to popular control. The immediate trigger for government collapse was the revelation of Chancellor John Aislaby's financial relationship with the South Sea Company. Parliamentary investigators discovered that Aislaby had received $27,000 worth of company shares through arrangements that violated his fiduciary responsibilities as the official responsible for protecting government financial interests. But Aislaby's corruption was particularly damaging because it revealed how business interests could exploit government officials' personal financial needs to influence policy decisions. Aislaby had substantial personal debts that his official salary couldn't cover. The South Sea Company had offered him financial relief through stock arrangements that appeared legitimate but were actually designed to ensure his support for company interests. The arrangement demonstrated how sophisticated corruption could operate through seemingly normal business transactions that created financial dependencies between government officials and private interests. Aislaby's case became a symbol of how business enterprises could purchase government authority through financial manipulation that exploited officials' personal vulnerabilities. But the most politically devastating revelation concerned the scope of government corruption beyond obvious financial arrangements. Investigators discovered that South Sea Company officials had provided government ministers with investment advice that helped them profit from other stock speculation. They had arranged favorable business deals for officials' family members. They had offered prestigious social opportunities that enhanced officials' personal and political standing. This broader corruption showed how business interests could create multiple forms of dependency that made government officials reluctant to regulate or investigate company operations, even when they weren't receiving direct bribes. The South Sea Company had essentially captured British government authority through a network of financial relationships that made independent oversight impossible. Parliamentary debates over government response revealed deep divisions about how to address corruption so systematic that prosecution of individual officials seemed inadequate. Whig opposition leaders demanded mass resignations of all government ministers who had any financial relationship with the South Sea Company. They argued that restoring public confidence required complete replacement of current government leadership, regardless of individual guilt or innocence. Tory government supporters argued that wholesale personnel changes would create government instability during an economic crisis that required experienced leadership to manage recovery efforts. But both sides agreed that existing government institutions had failed catastrophically to protect public interests from business fraud. The debate reflected broader questions about whether British constitutional arrangements were adequate for preventing future corruption of similar scope and sophistication. Some politicians proposed constitutional reforms that would prohibit government officials from having any business relationships that could create conflicts of interest. Others suggested institutional changes that would strengthen parliamentary oversight of government financial decisions. But these reform discussions were complicated by recognition that many of the politicians debating reforms had themselves benefited from favorable investment arrangements with bubble companies. The corruption had been so widespread that meaningful reform would require acknowledging and addressing financial relationships that implicated much of Britain's political leadership. The government's eventual response was a compromise that satisfied no one but avoided complete political collapse. Prime Minister Robert Walpole, who had opposed the South Sea scheme from the beginning and maintained clean hands throughout the bubble period, was appointed to lead government recovery efforts. Chancellor Aislabi was expelled from Parliament and faced criminal prosecution. Several other ministers resigned in disgrace. The South Sea Company was effectively nationalised with government assumption of responsibility for compensating victims through recovered company assets. But the fundamental structural problems that had enabled the corruption remained largely unaddressed. Government officials could still have business relationships that created conflicts of interest. Business enterprises could still influence policy through financial arrangements that were difficult to detect or prosecute. Parliamentary oversight of government financial decisions remained limited and often ineffective. The political response treated the South Sea crisis as an exceptional breakdown rather than a predictable result of systematic vulnerabilities in British government institutions. This limited response meant that many of the conditions that had made government corruption possible remained in place, creating risks for future crises involving relationships between business interests and political authority. But the immediate political consequences were serious enough to influence British political development for decades. Public trust in government integrity had been severely damaged. Voter skepticism about political promises and official assurances became a permanent feature of British political culture. More importantly, the crisis had demonstrated that sophisticated business interests could exploit government institutions in ways that threatened democratic accountability and popular sovereignty. The South Sea collapse established that financial complexity could be used as a weapon against democratic government by business enterprises that understood financial techniques better than the political officials responsible for oversight. This lesson would influence British approaches to financial regulation, corporate governance, and government accountability for generations. But it would also be forgotten and repeated in future crises, where business interests would again exploit government vulnerabilities through sophisticated financial manipulation that overwhelmed existing oversight capabilities. The government collapse triggered by the South Sea bubble wasn't just a political crisis. It was a warning about how democratic institutions could be undermined by business interests that combined financial expertise with political influence. That warning would prove prophetic, as similar patterns of corruption, manipulation, and institutional failure would recur throughout subsequent centuries of financial and political development. So we've witnessed how one impossible promise erased Britain's national debt, created Europe's first modern financial crisis, and toppled a government through systematic fraud that transferred wealth from ordinary citizens to privileged insiders. But the South Sea bubble's legacy extends far beyond 18th century Britain to influence how we understand financial markets, government regulation, and the relationship between private greed and public welfare. The parallels to contemporary financial scandals are impossible to ignore. The South Sea Company's use of complex financial instruments to obscure risks mirrors modern derivatives that few people understand, but everyone is affected by. Their manipulation of government officials through favorable investment opportunities resembles contemporary regulatory capture, where business interests influence the agencies supposed to oversee them. Most importantly, their transformation of speculation fever into social proof that overwhelmed rational analysis prefigures every major financial bubble from the dot-com crash to the 2008 housing crisis. But the South Sea bubble was more than just an early example of familiar financial pathologies. It was the moment when Britain and Europe learned that market-based economic systems could create mass prosperity or mass ruin, depending on how successfully they balanced innovation with regulation, private incentives with public oversight, and financial complexity with democratic accountability. The lessons Britain learned from their South Sea trauma influenced financial regulation for centuries. The requirement that corporations obtain government charters before selling shares to the public, restrictions on banking practices that enable excessive speculation, and parliamentary oversight of government financial decisions all trace their origins to reforms implemented after the South Sea collapse. These regulatory innovations helped Britain avoid another financial catastrophe on the South Sea scale for over 2 centuries. They established principles that informed financial regulation throughout the developing capitalist world. But the South Sea bubble also demonstrated something more troubling: how quickly hard-won regulatory protections can be eroded when financial innovation outpaces government understanding and business interests capture regulatory authority. The sophisticated manipulation techniques John Blunt pioneered in 1720 wouldn't be seen again until the development of modern financial markets in the 20th century. But when they reappeared in forms like pump-and-dump schemes, insider trading, and market manipulation, they proved just as effective at transferring wealth from ordinary investors to privileged insiders. The corruption strategies that allowed business interests to purchase government authority in 1720 have evolved, but not disappeared. Contemporary regulatory capture operates through consulting contracts, research funding, and revolving door employment rather than direct stock grants. But the fundamental dynamic remains unchanged. Business interests use financial relationships to influence government officials who are supposed to regulate them independently. Perhaps most ominously, the psychological dynamics that created speculation fever in 1720 have been systematized and weaponized through modern marketing and communication technologies. Social media creates the same social proof effects that convinced Isaac Newton to re-enter the South Sea market against his better judgment. Algorithm-driven news feeds create information bubbles that reinforce confirmation bias just as effectively as 18th century coffee houses. Financial complexity now obscures risks through computer models rather than legal documents, but the effect is identical. Ordinary people make financial decisions based on information they can't properly evaluate. The South Sea bubble established a template for financial exploitation that remains relevant because it was based on permanent features of human psychology rather than temporary technological or institutional conditions. People want to believe in solutions to serious problems even when those solutions seem too good to be true. They interpret social consensus as evidence of wisdom, even when that consensus is manufactured by people who profit from particular beliefs. They assume that complexity implies sophistication, even when complexity is designed to hide fraud. These psychological vulnerabilities haven't changed since 1720, which means the manipulation techniques the South Sea Company pioneered remain effective today. But the bubble also demonstrated something more hopeful: how societies can learn from financial catastrophes to build better institutions and stronger protections against future fraud. Britain's response to the South Sea crisis wasn't perfect, but it was effective enough to prevent comparable disasters for generations. They developed regulatory frameworks that balanced financial innovation with oversight, created institutional mechanisms for investigating and prosecuting financial fraud, and established cultural norms that treated extreme speculation with appropriate skepticism. Most importantly, they learned to recognize the warning signs of bubble psychology before speculation fever became uncontrollable. These lessons weren't permanent. They required constant reinforcement through education, regulation, and cultural transmission to new generations who hadn't experienced financial catastrophe personally. When Britain eventually forgot South Sea lessons and relaxed financial oversight, they experienced new crises that repeated familiar patterns of manipulation, corruption, and collapse. When other countries ignored British experience with financial regulation, they faced their own versions of South Sea-style disasters. The bubble's history suggests that protecting society from financial exploitation requires eternal vigilance rather than one-time solutions. But perhaps the most important lesson concerns the relationship between financial innovation and democratic governance. The South Sea Company succeeded because they understood financial complexity better than the government officials responsible for oversight. They used this expertise advantage to create arrangements that served their interests while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business activity. This pattern, sophisticated business interests exploiting government officials who lack comparable expertise, remains one of the most serious threats to democratic accountability in complex modern economies. The solution isn't eliminating financial innovation, which provides genuine benefits to economic development. It's ensuring that democratic institutions maintain sufficient expertise and independence to regulate financial innovation effectively. That requires investing in government capabilities that match private sector sophistication. It means creating incentive structures that prevent regulatory capture. Most importantly, it demands cultural commitment to the principle that complex financial arrangements must serve broad social purposes rather than just private profit. The South Sea Bubble demonstrated that financial markets are not self-regulating systems that automatically produce optimal outcomes. They are human institutions that reflect the values, incentives, and power relationships of the societies that create them. If those societies prioritize short-term private gain over long-term public welfare, financial markets will produce speculation bubbles, systematic fraud, and mass exploitation. If they maintain institutional checks on private power and cultural commitment to shared prosperity, financial markets can contribute to broad-based economic development. The choice between these outcomes isn't determined by abstract economic forces, but by specific political decisions about how to structure relationships between business interests and government authority. The South Sea Bubble's ultimate lesson is that financial markets are too important to be left to financial markets. They require democratic oversight, regulatory expertise, and cultural values that prioritize social welfare over private accumulation. Whether contemporary societies can maintain those priorities while benefiting from financial innovation remains the great unresolved challenge that the South Sea Bubble first revealed over 3 centuries ago. The merchants of 1720 London couldn't have imagined the global financial system we inhabit today, but their experience with speculation fever, government corruption, and systematic fraud established patterns that continue to shape how financial power interacts with political authority. Their story ended in catastrophe, but it doesn't have to be our story. If we can learn from their mistakes while building on their innovations, perhaps we can create financial institutions that serve human flourishing rather than human exploitation. That would be a legacy worthy of the suffering the South Sea Bubble inflicted and the lessons their catastrophe continues to teach.